Listen, for everyone, I'm going to talk for about maybe 25 minutes or so, but I really want to hear your questions and talk about it. This is important. Every week in the United States, since about March, has brought us a new news stories of public interest concerning the military and its connection both to the people of the United States and to its civilian leadership. Now we're in this electoral cycle at a time of pandemic, and civic consciousness about race, inequality, and division has made this topic of civil military relations acutely topical. Yet at the same time, it's often opaque and very confusing. The purpose of this talk to our alumni of HKS Executive Education is to try to unpack some of this debate and bring some clarity to the discussion. And thanks for the opportunity to talk with you. And after these remarks, I look forward to your questions. At Harvard, I teach on two topics that give me the most angst: civil military relations, and in the spring, the utility of military force in foreign policy. My hope in both of those courses is to try to inform future policymakers. So while the civil military relations in the United States are strong, and they're the envy of many countries of the world, we have frays and trends that we really need to discuss. The Army failed to meet its recruiting numbers in 2018. It lowered the goal for 2019 and did meet it. It lowered the goal even further in 2020 and met them, but largely because of very high retention numbers due to the pandemic. People did not want to get out of the military because they had a job and they had income coming in. We've also had flag officers, generals and admirals signing petitions in support of either the Biden administration or the Biden candidacy or the Trump administration. General Stan McChrystal, General Paul Selva, Admiral Paul Zunkampf, Mike Hayden, all have come out very strongly, all for candidate Biden. There's been three high-profile generals in the administration, all been asked to resign over the past 3 years. And this October, we passed the 19th anniversary of the start of the war in Afghanistan without an adequate end result in sight. So let me try to unpack some of those different features of civil military relations. There's a dilemma that every single nation in the world faces. How do you have a strong military, a military strong enough to defend the state that is not simultaneously a threat to that very state? Peter Feaver of Duke University calls this the civil military problematique. The United States has a long-standing distrust of a military in peacetime, for fear that such an institution would become immune to civil control. In fact, one of the complaints noted in our Declaration of Independence was that King George III of Great Britain has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislature, and has affected to render the military independent of and superior to civil power. That was written in our Declaration of Independence, a gripe against Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson also wrote in 1789 that there are instruments so dangerous to the rights of nations and which place them so totally at the mercy of their governors that those governors, whether legislative or executive, should be restrained from keeping such instruments on foot, except in well-defined cases. Such an instrument is a standing army. So our founders enshrined these fears in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, giving Congress the right to raise and support armies with an S, raise the army when it's needed and get rid of it when the war is over. This worked well up until about 1953, when at the height of the Cold War, it became clear that the military couldn't just disappear into nothing. We had to have a large standing military. And this created a dilemma for the United States and our ethos about a fear of that large standing military. In 1957, Samuel Huntington of Harvard provided a solution to this concern about having a military that is simultaneously capable of defending the state, but firmly subordinate to civilian control. Huntington advocated for a grand bargain. He advocated that the military must professionalize with its three attendant components of being expert in their craft, being responsible to the public, and being corporate in nature, meaning self-policing, self-accounting. And very importantly, also be strictly apolitical, stay only in their military lane. Many call this the bright line theory. Keep the spheres of what the military does and what civilian leaders do very separate with a bright line in between them. Huntington has been hugely influential with the United States military, more so than frankly with civilians who might believe more in an overlap of those spheres, a la Elliot Cohen or Jim Dubik. In fact, the 2017 Armed Forces Officers Guide, when it talks about the ethos of what an officer should be in our military, reads as if Samuel Huntington wrote it, 2017. So Huntington proposed a very useful framework. There's a functional imperative for a military, defend the state effectively, but there's also a social imperative for a military, stay subordinate to civil authority and reflect the values of the state. And due to the fact that the security of the state was in question in 1957 due to Soviet nuclear weapons, Huntington elevated the functional imperative and banked on professionalism to set everything right. But it is in this social imperative where most of the tensions occur. Think about the arguments for and against whether there's open homosexual service the 1990s with President Clinton, or women in combat roles more recently. And now think about when generals, retired or active, speak out about partisan political issues or candidates. That is causing tensions in the social imperative of this apolitical military. So how is the state of civil military relations in the United States today? I propose to you, and I'll show it behind me, a triangle. And this is a model. It's just a way of thinking about civil military relations. A model is useful in bringing clarity to this discussion, but you have to remember, as George Box famously said, all models are wrong. Some are useful. Leg one of this triangle is between the people and the military. It is about how do those two groups share societal ties? How do they share values? Is there mutual understanding between them, and is there mutual respect? The risk, if we have a rift or a crisis in this leg of the triangle between the people and the military, is a disconnection of the military from the society it's sworn to serve. You have the potential for the creation of a warrior caste. You also have a potential for questioning, what does it mean to be a citizen? Is there evidence of this? Well, the public confidence in the military is very, very high. As late as June of 2020, the military is the highest respected institution in the country at 72%, Supreme Court at 40%, and Congress at 13%. However, that confidence in the military, that regard for the military, is not seen in adults thinking about having their children serve. There's only 15% propensity to serve in this country. And the number one indicator on whether a young man or woman will join the military is if that young person has someone in their immediate family in the military already, which is this warrior caste that could be a concern. There's also cognitive separation. The general public doesn't know the military very well. There's geographic separation. About 50% of all of the recruits that come into the US military come from only 6 US states, which means that the military is not representative of all 50 states to the degree that we would want them to be. So there's also this idea that they might not understand each other well. In a recent survey, 75% of military respondents agreed with the statement that said the military community has little in common with the rest of the country, and most civilians don't understand the military. So this is becoming a bit of a problem. The second leg of the triangle is between the military and the government. This is the one that we think of in terms of generals giving advice to presidents, soldiers being asked to implement policies. So it's this connection that very traditionally people think of as civil-military relations. This is about the control of the military. It's about how the military provides its advice to civilian leaders, about the understanding of the intent of that decision that was made by a civilian leader. Does the military understand why they're doing what they need to be doing, and therefore fully and faithfully implement those policies? The risk, if we don't get this right, is the potential for political intervention. And we're not talking coups in the United States. The last time there was even serious talk of a coup was in 1783 in Newburgh, when George Washington famously talked his officers out of an expedition to go to Philadelphia and demand their back pay. But political intervention takes many forms. The fact that the F-35 fighter is produced in 46 US states and territories tells us that it was purposefully set up that way so as to garner widespread support in Congress. There's also the potential for inadvertent escalation if the military doesn't understand or doesn't have a good connection with the intent behind policy. That you could also have goal displacement, which is a military leader on the ground does what he or she thinks might be best tactically or militarily, following their own goals rather than the intent of the policy as it was created in the Capitol. And the end result of those kind of things could be strategic incoherence, where you are in constant war without necessarily achieving the political outcomes you went to war in the first place. So what's the evidence look like of crisis potentially in this leg of the triangle? Well, as I said, there hasn't been ever an attempted coup in the United States, but plenty of retired officers are making comments on policy and on candidates. Rarely has there been an active duty comments a la Colin Powell's foreign affairs article in 1992, but still a lot of public statements out there. There has been, frankly, shirking, meaning a little bit of goal displacement on some of these social imperative issues, whether that was open homosexual service in the 1990s, Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or even women in combat roles. Some foot dragging, if you will. And as I noted, 19 years of relatively inconclusive war, with the one strategic goal that has been achieved, the prevention of another 9/11 attack on the American homeland. But there are other goals we had been hoping to achieve and have not yet brought them to fruition. For the most part, generals venerate the Huntingtonian ethic of staying out of politics. But this careful behavior not to tread across this bright line has caused many generals to divorce what they do on the battlefield from the overall political objectives set by the country's policy for war in the first place. And to be successful, generals must avoid, in my opinion, active partisan politics. They must be, however, they must be extremely aware of and responsive to the political environment into which their advice is given. So there's a number of things that generals cannot do. We would call this no-go terrain, absolutely wrong to do. Some of these things would be lobbying Congress or the public on support of a president or a partisan issue. Considering public opinion and the offering of its military advice, also something that should not be done. Timing decisions or actions so as to have an eye on U.S. domestic politics is also not to be done. And finally, taking public or partisan positions on issues that are still under debate is something that generals and admirals must avoid. But understanding the political environment is absolutely necessary for these generals to do. They need to understand, as they do, that their actions that they take on the ground have impact on the efficacy of other elements of US power, on the efficacy of a coalition's combined effort, on the legitimacy of what they're doing in terms of publics around the world. They must know the strategic ends that motivate policy. They must understand that there are competing national interests and that there are resource trade-offs behind agency efforts. The final leg of the civ-mil triangle is almost counterintuitive. And some of you might be thinking in your mind, the people to the government, that seems like a stretch. I would say it's one of the most important legs of this triangle, because what this is really about is the discourse between a public and those that represent them in government on issues like, when do we go to war? When do we use force? For what purposes does our military exist? For what purposes is our military being sent abroad? How are these forces going to be manned? How are they going to be paid for? Who pays for war? These are all important discussions that must happen. And if they don't happen, there's several important risks. The first being a lack of checks and balances. If Congress is not doing their part of this portion of government, this tripartite government that we have, the president then becomes more imperial in the use of force. We could have constant war if we're not discussing what are we doing and why are we there. And at the end of the day, this could mean strategic insolvency, where the cost starts becoming overbearing on the ability of the country to bear those costs. So what's our evidence of crisis in this leg of the triangle? I would say the fact that the authorization for the use of military force that was dated 14 September 2001 and still being used to justify our forces around the globe fighting terrorism without having been revisited by the US Congress says that not interested in having that debate. And despite incredibly vitriolic partisanship in the United States, the one thing that the parties can agree on between themselves is to limit debate about these wars. They can agree on no taxes, no draft, but no votes, and we're funding it all through deficit spending. And they can do that because the cost of war is relatively low. Afghanistan costs the average American less than $200 per year. And even though one is one too many, it appears that the 17 Americans killed in Afghanistan in 2019 was not high enough of a number to cause there to be debate about what are we doing there. And in 2024, it is projected before even COVID that interest payments on the debt will exceed the Defense Department budget. In this lack of debate caused then Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis in July of 2018 to label this intergenerational theft, the stealing of our kids and grandkids, because we today aren't debating these important issues. So now back to Huntington. The all-volunteer force that came into being after the Vietnam War has allowed all ranks to professionalize. Huntington had only talked about the officer corps, but now the force is incredibly professional across all its ranks. It's a very good force now, but there's cognitive separation that's bringing adverse outcomes to the country. We have federal police in Portland being confused with being troops because Americans can't tell the difference between police in uniform and soldiers in uniform. There's National Guard been called out in areas of civil unrest, being confused that they had been ordered by the president, which they were not. They were brought out by the governor under his or her authority. We have troops now in 80 plus nations around the world, largely out of sight and out of mind. And increasingly, we see flag officers, generals, and admirals in the news on partisan political issues. So in times of electoral politics, there's a heightened concern about the use of troops and the outspokenness of more and more retired generals. The military in a time of sharp presidential and congressional elections, in my opinion, the military, to include the Guard, should not be used at polling sites unless there's dire emergency beyond the capability of law enforcement to handle. Retired generals, again, in my opinion, should stay out of the public and partisan limelight. If they feel that strongly, they should run for office. Military can and should be focused on remaining a deterrent during these times against nations who might think that America is distracted and weak and therefore looking for an advantage against America. And I would say the military has a very important role during this turbulent electoral time to maintain that strong deterrent. In conclusion, when I look at the triangle over my shoulder, I don't see a current crisis, but I see frays. I see things that ought to concern us in all three legs. Most troubling for me is there's no debate about this. The American public thanks the military for its service, but doesn't take the next step of demanding debate on what are they doing. So what can we do? We're doing it today. We're trying to keep these discussions going, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks.
So we have quite a few questions and a couple of raised hands as well. So let's start with the raised hands. So Dahir, Ahmed, I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question. I see your hand is raised.
Sir, my question is how to ensure that the armed forces do not get involved in contingent politics as civil and military relationships increase?
Yeah, so I think what I got your question is, how do we ensure that military forces don't become involved in politics? This is the good thing is that's not a concern for me in the United States. I think we have a very well-established norms of where the military should be. I think this professional force will not get involved in politics. What I worry about is retired generals getting involved in politics. That's more of a concern than active duty troops getting involved. Let me assure you, if there is the need for a transition of presidential administrations in January, the military doesn't have a role in that. There are plenty of institutions in the United States that are fully capable of ensuring that transition happens. So I don't see that as an issue at all. What I am concerned with is there's so much hyperbole, there's so much confusing rhetoric that is being said in the news in different circles that we're raising fear of the military in a time of electoral politics, when I think it's one of the great stabilizing and calming forces, at least for the United States. Thank you for your question, Dahir.
Thank you, sir.
Great. We also have a written question from Michael Lynn. He says, I train regularly in the firearms community where several trainers are retired LEOs and military. With ammo being bought up by the military, is the military truly worried about widespread civil and urban insurgency against militia groups and anarchists? How are officers versus enlisted men positioned in the event of the Insurrection Act be activated by a president who refuses to vacate office?
Okay, there's a whole lot of questions there. Let me just say, the United States has always had longstanding ammunition. The United States military ammunition requirements. I don't believe that the military is actively going out and stockpiling ammunition so that the civilian populace won't have any. I just don't believe that that is true. I think what we have, if it is shortfalls of ammunition in some circles, and I've heard of that, it's probably because of supply and demand. I know that weapons sales are up among the general public over the past 6 months. That concerns me. And it certainly concerns law enforcement officers across the country. I think the fact that ammunition might be in limited supply is one of supply and demand rather than the U.S. military going out and buying it. An important thing that I need to say is the president, should he be voted out of office, refuses to leave, and tries to invoke the Insurrection Act. These are constitutional questions. These are fundamental, and I have such great confidence that that's not, the White House is a building. The presidency is not a location. It is an institution. When the president flies on Air Force One, the presidency is in that airplane. And so, I think that this is part of the hyperbole. I strongly believe we will never come to this, but you can count on the military doing what's legal, what's constitutional, being incredibly professional, and following the guidance of very experienced leaders who are very much concerned with America as a still remaining a beacon on the hill. So I don't see that. I worry about the hyperbole, and I just hope to, in my talk today, just say those are fears that fearmongers want to push, not what I believe is true. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Michael. We have a raised hands from Hans Christian Hagman. I'm going to allow you to talk and unmute you, Hans.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
I sure can. Hey, good to hear from you.
Great seeing you again, General. Thank you very much for an excellent talk. But looking at it from a glass half empty, if I'm sitting in Moscow or Beijing, one could see that the U.S. civil-military relations are fraught by a lot of vulnerabilities. And in the spirit of knowing yourself and knowing your enemy, and 100 battles you'll never be in peril, what are the vulnerabilities as seen from the opponent of the U.S. system? And what do we need to keep our eyes on when it comes to others wanting to use these vulnerabilities? I'm thinking especially in a hybrid warfare environment of disinformation, of using non-kinetic forces, of information operations, and so forth. How can this, what we see as a strength, be used against us? Thank you, General.
No, it's really good. You've got several layers of questions there. One of the systemic vulnerabilities of the United States military now is this concern with what's the future of the all-volunteer force, making sure that the military can be populated by men and women who want to serve, with 15% propensity to serve, an average of only 30% of the 18 to 24-year-olds in the country able to serve, meaning no medical condition, no moral waivers or moral concerns like police prison records or anything like that in their background, and being high school graduates. That combination of lack of a population able to serve with a very low propensity to serve, and the services still have to recruit about 200,000 every year out of a pool that's probably only about 300,000 big of even possible to come in, makes it very, very hard. So one of our vulnerabilities is cognitive. If moms and dads out there in the country decide that the military is not what they want their child to do, they are very influential and could even lower that propensity to serve even more. The fact that we are now doing very large enlistment bonuses creates a vulnerability because it becomes exceedingly expensive to man our force. And as you know, $40,000 of an enlistment bonus is not much to someone who comes from a wealthier socioeconomic class, and yet it's a life-changing for those in lower socioeconomic classes. And so we run the risk of again having a military that's not representative of the whole country, but only of a subset. So that's at one end of it. You talk more of on the tactical side or the vulnerabilities in information warfare or hybrid warfare. This is absolutely true. We have arguably, and I would say at scale, not arguably, the best cyber defense capabilities in the world. One of our challenges is, though, our American public and our norms, we don't like propaganda. So what we call information operations, others might call, well, that's propaganda. And I don't think that those are the same things. And yet, so we purposefully, won't be first with any news. We want to be first with the truth, but the truth is very elusive at times, which causes us to be a little bit slow in the response to some of our adversaries who are not so concerned with truth. Think about ISIS and their shock videos from a few years ago, kind of information operations. The Russians have proved remarkably competent in hybrid warfare or trying to gain things, territory or disruption that in past decades could only be done in war at a threshold less than war. And so it's this whole cognitive understanding of when we're at war. And again, that's something that the United States is grappling with, has not cured. And these kind of discussions are very important because the public needs to understand them as well. So Hans, you asked a very, very important question. We definitely have vulnerabilities. Our adversaries are intelligent and they look for those kind of vulnerabilities to exploit, and we do our very best to not give them a soft underbelly. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. We have a written question from Sarah Sketch. What is the military doing to intervene with white supremacist radical groups like Oath Keepers who are recruiting from the military?
I don't have an answer to that other than extremism on any side of a spectrum is incommensurate with being an active or reserve or National Guard soldier or airman or sailor. As we find that people are through their social media, either on the far right or the far left, anarchists, whatever they happen to be, we take very aggressive steps to get them out of the military. But what does that mean if they are kicked out? Can we prevent them from joining a militia or a radical group on another side? This is difficult after they get out of the military. I know that we work very hard to inculcate values that are not commensurate with participation in those kind of groups. It is our hope that this inculcation of values is sticky and it keeps people from wanting to do those kind of things. But as we've seen up in Michigan or other places, it's not foolproof, and we've got much more work to do. Thanks.
Thank you. We have a written question that says, you mentioned that the military should be apolitical. How do you reconcile the endorsements by senior military officials, officers of both candidates today?
Yeah, I can't reconcile that. This is why at the end of my talk, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution gives every citizen the right to speak his or her mind. Just because you join the military does not mean you give up citizenship rights. And therefore, there's a strong argument by those who have spoken up that it is their right to do so. In fact, many would argue it's their responsibility to do so, to speak up when they really feel so strongly about it. They all know, however, that their speaking up is costly to the rest of the profession that is still serving. It's costly to those in leadership jobs. It's costly to the relationship between the military and the public in this country. It is my hope that military leaders don't do that. I have never signed any of the petitions I've been asked to sign once I retired. But that's a personal decision of mine. Several chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, starting with Admiral Mike Mullen and then General Marty Dempsey and the latest General Joe Dunford, have all taken a very similar stance to what I'm saying, which is, generals, please, you make generals and admirals, you make things more difficult when you speak out. And so please don't on partisan electoral politics. But they don't have the ability to forbid it. The First Amendment of our Constitution gives all generals that right. My point is it might not be the prudent thing to do. It certainly, in my opinion, also is more disruptive than it is calming for this country. Because only 31% of the country, in a poll taken in 2019, knew that Secretary Jim Mattis was a retired general. They thought he was still General Mattis, not retired, still on active duty. So just because they say they're a retired general, a lot of people don't make that distinction. They hear general and therefore assume that that person is still serving actively. And that's where this can become very difficult. That's a great question. Thank you.
We have Ralph Bello Fadil. Ralph, do you have a question?
My question is based on the triangle you have presented. From the triangle, it appears the people on top formulate or form the government and the military. Now, in such a situation, if there is the government, where does the military stand? Because both the government and the military are formed by the people, and they are supposed to be answerable to the people. Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah, Ralph, can you restate your question one more time? There was a part that got cut out.
Okay.
The important part in the middle.
My question is based on your triangle, with the people at the top, the military and the government and the basement. Now, the military and the government are all formed by the people at the top. In a situation where there is a problem between the people and the government, in other words, when there's a protest, the protest is normally against the government. Where does the military come in the civil-military relationship you have tried to enumerate?
No, it's a good point. Well, the first thing I would say is that triangle model is just like George Bach said, all models are wrong. Some have utility, some are useful. I would say what that model helps me do is bring clarity to some of the discussions. But you're exactly right. The military has a role in that connection of the people to its government. If there is a protest, and I spoke about this earlier, it is the responsibility of states and localities in the American context to deal with those protests. And they're doing it with local law enforcement officials. In the United States model, we have the National Guard. The National Guard belongs to the governors of every state. And only if the National Guard is federalized by the president can it be used as federal forces. And so those National Guard troops could be called out, some have by governors, to back up the police in these areas of civil unrest. My point to you, and I think I made it earlier, is most Americans, I can look at a National Guard soldier in uniform, and I know very instantly that that is a National Guard soldier because I can read the patches that are on their uniform. But an American just off, in any place in a part of the country that is not steeped in which different patches are active duty or reserve might not know that distinction, because a National Guard soldier has their name and has U.S. Army on their uniform. Same with an active duty soldier. It's only the patches on their shoulders that tell any different story. And so it's very confusing. And therefore, in my opinion, governors ought to be reticent at calling out the National Guard in civil unrest just because it puts at risk the civil-military relationship. That being said, every governor has to make that decision on what is best for the security of his or her people, the security of whatever property may be along, the security of the law enforcement officials, and whether they have the capacity to handle it. And those are decisions that governors need to make, city mayors need to make. I strongly believe that unless we are at a very, very difficult straits, the president ought to stay out. The Insurrection Act should not be invoked, and it should be handled locally. And then the governor has other tools that he or she could bring out otherwise. That's the American model. Every country resolves this problem of how do you have a military strong enough to defend itself and that same military still being subordinate to civilian control at all times. And how they resolve that dilemma is really done by every country in the world in different manners. And so I don't want to presuppose that the United States has it right. We have it as right as we've been able to make it, and we keep trying to improve. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. Next, we have a question from John Roche. John, I believe you're from Europe. So John is asking, why are so many Americans obsessed with the war instead of peace? In movies and the media, and why have your troops in 80 countries? Many of these places don't need U.S. help. The concept of war cast is amazing coming from a neutral country in Europe. Is it really taken seriously in the U.S. and your triangle? Do the people really have any control of the military?
Yeah, there's a lot of pointed questions in that. I would say that Americans are not obsessed with war. Unfortunately, right now, there's just not a debate. So instead of obsessed with war, it's almost indifference in many circles, and that's a concern. The warrior caste is not something that we want or even seek, but unless the propensity to serve in the military increases, then you end up having most recruitment coming from families that already have somebody in the military. I'm not saying that that's good. In fact, I would prefer that not to be the case. But propensity to serve in an all-volunteer force of the size that we have is difficult, as I discussed in my talk. The last thing that you talk about is, why do we have soldiers in 80 countries? They don't need our help. If they didn't ask us to come in, there's only a couple countries where we are there without the government asking us to be there. And even then, we don't stay for very long. We wouldn't be there. And so it is it's not that we're going around trying to be the global policeman for the world. I just think that there are problems in a lot of countries. They request our assistance. We have some capabilities and ability to train and help that country resolve their own challenges. Should we be in 80 countries? That's a question for Congress and the president to have a debate. And I would love to see that debate. We just don't see it right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thomas Forrest, you have a live question.
Hey, General, how are you? I served with you actually in Afghanistan. I worked with General McHale and ran the J9 Civil Military Operations Office at US-4A. Good to see you. I have a question, though. We, of course, as a military, and I'm a Navy captain, but we as a joint force have a lot of civil military operations experience overseas. And I know that we have Joint Task Force Civil Support that works with DISCA operations here in the U.S., but and the Army, of course, has a civil affairs branch, but is there anything you could see from our professionalism using civil military operations overseas that could be applied here domestically?
Yeah, I have made the distinction, and I probably should have been clearer, that when I talk about civil military relations, that is different from civil military coordination in a theater or civil affairs or things like that. But they are definitely connected. When you talked about DISCA, you're talking about defense support to civil authorities. That happens. There's another hurricane coming down on the southern coast. There will be support from some military organizations, probably National Guard, to those communities when this comes out. The course that I teach in the fall on civil military relations, I call it Working Together, how to achieve success in foreign policy. That's really at the highest level. But as you very rightly know, working together at the ground level is also incredibly important. We have tried to do that and we still don't do it really well. We had provincial reconstruction teams in both Iraq and Afghanistan with an attempt to bridge that, to have civilian and military working closely together on issues like agriculture or healthcare, education, governance, and to limited degrees of success. A lot of times because they were mostly manned by military folks rather than by a combination required when they originally conceived ideas, as you know very well. Is there a role for civil affairs in the United States? There is certainly a role in getting this discussion going. We need to be very careful as a military that we're not being seen as manipulating the public or manipulating politics or anything like that. And unfortunately, in this very vitriolic political climate, oftentimes what a military does, very well-meaning, gets spun in different directions that are counterproductive, as you well know. So, I always believe that there is a great opportunity for working closer together, even in a domestic context. I think we do it behind the scenes, very carefully. Think about Operation Warp Speed. General Gus Perna, the commander of Materiel Command, the 4-star, has been put in charge of that. But he's the first to say there's not going to be a military, dude at all distributing a potential vaccine in the first quarter of next year, January to April. Rather, that's being done by civilian firms through government and local officials. The military is really there for planning, logistical analysis, and contracting, which we do very well. And so even a thing like distributing a potential COVID vaccine has the potential of becoming politicized. And what General Perna is working very hard to do is say, no, this is us working for civil government at multiple levels. We've got unique skills and capabilities, but not if we're out there in uniform manning all of those things and doing it all ourselves. That's not the way we should be working together. And I applaud General Perna and his team for the great work that they're doing. That's a great question. Thank you for your service, Thomas, and look forward to seeing you again sometime.
Great. Another question, a Q&A written question. Do you see a need or the potential for increased utilization of private military contractors to conduct operations in the military? Conduct operations the military either cannot adequately perform or is prohibited by law from performing?
I admit to not being a fan of private military contractors. I have not been a fan of them since whenevers. The Russians are using private military contractors in Syria. They're using them in Libya. They do that to get around accusations that these are Russian troops. The problem often with professional military contractors or private military contractors lies in the level of professionalism. I would say they might be very, very good at their craft, but they might not always hold the same values that soldiers are expected to do. I think about Blackwater and the incident at the traffic circle in Baghdad, and that's because their job was to protect the people in their vehicles, whereas a soldier in that same instance has kind of two jobs: it's to protect the people as well as protecting themselves. And so there's different motivations for action. I am not a fan of private military contractors in any kind of combat role. Now, there's certainly roles for private military contractors in doing things that are inherently not combat. Cooking in dining facilities, transportation of of fuel or other things that that can be done. You don't have to be a soldier to do maintenance of airplanes. Those things can all be done by contractors. But when it comes to using a private military contractor in a combat role, I'm very much opposed to it because I worry about the lack of inculcation to the values that have become the hallmark of the U.S. and other militaries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think we have time for just one more question. John Adeyemo, are you still here? And do you have a question?
Hello. Thank you, General, for your presentation. It's quite enlightening. But I'm of the opinion that it should be too early to consider the mentioned Lekki incidents in Nigeria on 20th October this year as a massacre, considering that a lot of international and national reported details of that incident still being considered. Looking at the social media perspective of it, that a lot were detected. So I think it should be better and fair to consider it otherwise, because there has not been concrete evidence to consider it a massacre as at now. That's my opinion.
No, I appreciate that. And if I gave any indication in my remarks to the earlier question that I always know that first reports are incorrect, that there's always motivations on many different sides to put a spin on activities. And so I'm very slow to judge anything that I read about, especially in social media or the press. So John, you make a really good point. It is very early to cast dispersions. My response to that question from your colleague from Nigeria was more to just say, it is important to continually attempt to professionalize military forces so that there's never a question that thing could be, caused by unruliness or such. But you make a very good point. And on that note, I just want to thank you all for staying on for this hour and talking about civil military relations. I think that this is incredibly important.